This is the first administration in my lifetime where you say it could be worse than my actual worst case scenario. The darkness of this administration is beyond anything I've ever seen.
Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller. Delighted to welcome back one of our favorites. He's an opinion columnist for the New York Times. He's also co-host of the legal podcast Advisory Opinions. It's David French. How you doing, David?
Tim, great to see you.
Good to see you as well. A bunch to get into. I want to start with what is happening at the Supreme Court. We are going to get at the end to some real weird stuff happening in MAGA world. I promise you that. Tim,
that's so uncharacteristic. You're saying there's some weird stuff going on with MAGA? No, I'm skeptical.
Hey, sometimes, everybody has what is it? The strange cousin? It's just for MAGA, it's all the cousins. I haven't had a chance to talk about it this week, but on Monday, we had arguments in the Trump versus Slaughter case, which is about giving Trump and giving any president more powers to fire civil servants. Well, actually, why don't you just explain the case and what you think's happening?
Yeah. So on Monday, the court heard arguments in Trump v. Slaughter, which is this case about the firing of an FTC commissioner. Now, this is one of those really interesting areas where old school conservatism meets Trumpism. Well, I wouldn't say meets Trumpism. There's some overlap with Trumpism. And that is that the FTC is one of these multi-member commissions created years ago. There's a number of these where they're located in the executive branch, but they're kind of hybrid agencies. They're supposed to be in the executive branch, but also immune from some degree of executive branch oversight. You can only fire the commissioners for cause, for example. And this has been something that conservatives for a long time, legal conservatives, have really bristled at because they look at these multi-member commissions as almost creating a kind of a new branch of government. They're not really under the control of the legislature. They're not really totally control of the president. They result in the conservative argument, one that I happen to share, they result in kind of an entrenched bureaucracy that isn't really accountable, purely accountable to the president, not purely accountable to Congress, not really accountable to the people because it's so far removed from the people. And this is kind of a legacy and hangover of the progressive era, sort of this idea that, look, administrative states need a lot of technocratic expertise, and we need to insulate technocratic expertise from political accountability. And, there are problems attached to that. The way I've described what's going on here with the court is we're very much, Tim, at what I would say a fork in the road. Think of it as we've got one of two destinations, the good place or the bad place. and here's the bad place. There's no purgatory
in this world?
Nope. It's one or the other, Tim. It's all one or the others. It's to use the old phrase, turn or burn. Like those are your two options, right? And so here's the bad place, and then I'll tell you the good place. The bad place would be if the Supreme Court does what I think has been kind of consistent with originalist philosophy forever and ever and said, wait, these hybrid agencies are structurally not in conformance with the Constitution. If it's an executive agency, it's got to be under the president. If you wanted something with Congress having a lot of control, you create a legislative agency like the Congressional Budget Office created at the tail end of the Nixon era. But the bad outcome would be, okay, you give the president greater authority over the executive branch, but then you also give the executive branch greater authority. That would be if you upheld, say, the birthright citizenship order that Trump.
Well, that's where I was going next, and and there's been some interesting kind of analysis of what we were hearing from the judges of that. What did you think? The justices, rather.
I think they've taken the case to uphold birthright citizenship. It's very difficult for me to imagine an executive order sort of overturning more than a century of American law that is also, by the way, promulgated by statute. So you have the constitutional provision, you have a statutory citizenship provision, and then you have this Trump executive order. And I don't think that Trump executive order is going to trump the statute. I don't think he's got a proper understanding of the Constitution here. There's exactly on point Supreme Court authority from right close to the generation that actually passed the 14th Amendment. So I think you've got a lot of things against the Trump administration. Very similar with the tariff case. So the bad place, though, is let's say the court gives Trump more power over the executive branch and then allows the executive branch to do what Trump wants to do and grab more power. But I don't think that's what's happening. I think what's happening is this. They're going to give Trump more power over the executive branch, or give all presidents, let's put it this way, all presidents more power over the executive branch, but also make the executive branch less powerful by extending the Biden era precedents around vaccine mandates and student loans into tariffs, into birthright citizenship, so that presidents who want to be lawmakers are just going to be shut out. A president is a law executor, which is very different from a lawmaker. And so I think that's where they're headed. And I think that's the better place, or the good place, is greater political accountability for a diminished executive branch. The bad place would be greater executive authority over a more powerful executive branch.
Yeah, I'm instinctively with you on that. I guess let me just on the first part. I guess let me ask. I do think that there's some risks associated with giving him this kind of firing power.
Sure.
And with politicizing all of these offices. I mean, you see that potentially, obviously, does this extend to the Fed? And does that, then raise questions about the Fed independence? Obviously, we're seeing some of this at HHS with, now we're going to get rid of scientists and put in quacks at some of these commissions. We had a measles outbreak. We're quarantining people in South Carolina right now over measles. So that's where we are as a country.
Horrible.
So, what would be your pushback to that? We do need some of these commissions to be independent.
The problem you have here is you have three branches of government: judiciary, executive, and legislative. If you want to create an additional branch of independent sort of technocrats, how do you do that? I mean, I think that might be constitutional amendment territory, where you sort of delegate some political functions over to independent, non-accountable, technocratic bureaucracies, or that have very, very, very limited democratic accountability. The problem here, though, Tim, we are often conflating things. This case was about one of the heads of the agency. Part of electing a president is you're electing a person with hiring and firing power of cabinet agencies, of the top people in the executive branch. The top people in the executive branch serve at the pleasure of the president. But what Trump is doing is something different that wasn't at issue in this case. So this case was about the top person, one of the top people. But he's also firing people up and down the bureaucracy, including lots of people who have civil service protections. And that's where you're getting into some of your scientists, for example.
Yeah.
But the problem is, even if you keep all those scientists, if the top person is Robert F. Kennedy and then his boss is Donald Trump, you've got a load of problems. However,
Sure. There's still some good stuff happening, though. I don't want out there. I saw somebody at the airport recently who's at one of these like small commissions tucked into one of the departments. I'm not going to out them. And
do not out them, Tim.
Yeah, they're like, I'm listening to your podcast every day, and I'm like, and they told me what they did, and I was like, how have you not been fired yet? They're like, I don't know. They're like, I don't know. They don't know. They don't know that we're here. There's only 5 of us in this corner office, and so sometimes there are civil servants that can do good work that don't have the oversight of those. Whatever, the political leadership.
I mean, it's a big government. It's a very big government, lots of different arms and tentacles of it. But where I really, really part company with the Trump administration is they're doing much more than firing agency heads or commissioners. They're firing civil service protected prosecutors, for example, creating a reign of terror up and down the ranks of sniffing out and ferreting out people, many of whom enjoy these civil service protections. They're not policy-making individuals. They're not policy-making figures, and they're being fired. And that is beyond any sort of unitary executive theory that has what you would call mainstream on the right. That's turning it to 11, to use the Spinal Tap reference. But this case is about the heads of the commissioners themselves. And the interesting thing about it, if you listen to the oral argument, 2 things were pretty clear at once. One was lots of members of the court seem to want to have a narrow ruling here, not a big, broad ruling injecting the presidency with testosterone. No, they wanted a narrow ruling, one that seemed to be maybe even not entirely clearly overturning Humphrey's executor, although I think That's the case that allowed the independent commissioners to begin with from 1935. But it might overturn it, but not in as dramatic a way as you might think. And then the other thing that came out was Justice Gorsuch in particular, who took a big lead in the tariff case. He came out of the tariff case swinging at oral argument on these tariffs. I mean, as I was listening to Justice Gorsuch on the tariffs, I was like, dude doesn't like these tariffs. And then when he was quizzing D. John Sauer, the Solicitor General, he was calling back to that very concept and basically saying exactly what I just said earlier. Like, okay, are you ready for a diminished executive? You know, if you're going to get this additional power to hire and fire these commissioners, there's something else going along with it, this diminished executive. And even in the oral argument, Sauer was not, again, this is the Trump Solicitor General, Sauer was definitely not circling the wagons on trying to do anything about the Fed. And it was very clear from the oral argument that the Supreme Court, and also from previous opinions, the Supreme Court views the Fed as something very, very different. And so what I would say to those who are looking at the court, and this is true now, and it's been true for a long time, think of the court as a collection of pre-Trump conservatives. And when Trumpism overlaps with pre-Trump conservatism, they tend to give Trump a win. When Trump doesn't overlap with pre-Trump conservatism, they tend to give Trump losses. And so that's the clash. That's also why a lot of liberals still are very nervous about the court, because they are, at the end of the day, still pre-Trump conservatives.
Yeah, they overturned Roe, which was a pre-Trump conservative position, right? For example.
Right, exactly.
Just really quick, because we're getting pretty nerdy now, but like you just piqued my interest. How is the Fed different? Doesn't that just run afoul of what you said? Haven't we just kind of in some ways created a fourth branch of the government with the Fed?
The Fed is seen as something different, a legacy of the second Bacon in the United States. It is not an executive agency purely in the way that so if you look at the structure of American government, you have executive agencies, you have legislative agencies. And one of the problems with the Fed is with the FTC is you have a lawmaking entity, because the FTC promulgates regulations, things like that, under the executive. But that's not what the executive is supposed to do. It's not supposed to be a lawmaking branch of government. And so the Fed, though, honestly, Tim, the Fed has a very unique history. The Fed is not located under the executive branch in the same way that, say, the FTC is. And then also there are greater consequences when you're talking about uprooting the Fed. And one of the things about precedent is that one of the calculations when it comes to precedent is something called reliance interests. How much has society, how much have people shaped their decisions? How much is the economy shaped by a particular arrangement, et cetera? And so when there has been an enormous amount of reliance, stare decisis, that's the weight we give precedent, gets more weighty. It gets more potent. And so I think that there's a lot of reasons why the Supreme Court has said, Fed's different. Fed's different.
You expect that, law school grads and legal stuff is much more, kind of based on the details, and it's precise. And then sometimes you get to a thing and you're like, it's just a little bit more weighty than the stare decisis and other. It's it's in the eye of the beholder sometimes.
Yeah. That's why it's just wrong to think of the law like you would think of a science. Right. Now, there are some parts of the law that are routinely applied every day uncontroversially. Like one of the things I talk to people, what's one of the biggest misconceptions about the law? And I say, well, one of the biggest misconceptions is that every case is in doubt or every case is controversial. Most cases, vast majority, for example, of Court of Appeals cases are decided 3-0. Ideological alignments don't matter. So there's an enormous amount of law that is just almost rote in its application. It's just, okay, once you learn it, you apply it, it's done. But then there's another sliver, which happens to be the most controversial. These are the Supreme Court cases. The court doesn't take the easiest cases. It takes the hardest cases. And there's both principles that apply and judgment. This is something that Gorsuch is fond of saying. At the end of the day, it's very difficult to escape the idea that judges exercise judgment when weighing competing interests. And so, yeah, inescapably in the practice of law, there are subjective elements. There are a lot of objective elements, but there's also a lot of subjective as well. And we're just never going to get out of that. We're not going to have ChatGPT running our legal system.
Sam
ever.
Altman would think differently. Yeah, no, it's the judgment side of that is really even more than the ideology where I got crossways with Clarence Thomas. Oh, the 2020 election, but we'll save that again. I've done that rant a couple times already. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by the idea of learning a new language, you're not alone. Studies show that 70 to 90% of people try to learn a new language and then give up. Fortunately, Babbel is built so that it's really easy to get started. They understand that people learn differently. Their bite-sized lessons fit easily into your daily routine and are also easy to remember. Just 10 minutes a day is enough to start seeing real results. Babbel recognizes that real-world connections are at the heart of language learning. Their courses are designed by over 200 language experts, real human beings, to teach you relevant words and the phrases you'll actually use, so you can start speaking with confidence in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel lets you practice real-life conversation step by step without the stress. You'll build the confidence to speak up when it matters, from ordering a coffee to chatting with new friends abroad. And Babbel is more than just lessons. They even offer a large collection of podcasts where Babbel experts reveal language secrets and offer an inside look at local cultures. This morning on Drop Off, I'm usually not doing drop off, okay, at school. Luckily, my husband is doing that, and so I'm preparing for you guys in this podcast. So I want an extra cookie from you guys. I want an extra bonus point that I'm doing podcast prep and school drop off this week, and still delivering David French excellence to you this morning. But we're in the car, and the Geese song "Op Ed to Cocaine" comes on, and Toulouse is in the back, and she says, "Hey, what does that say?" And I was like, "Well, you know what it says. You're taking French. And I'm doing a little Babbel with you." And she's like, "Yeah, it's in the city of cocaine." She's like, "What's cocaine?" It's like, "No, that's something you don't learn from Babbel." And I told her it's just a place. It's just a place. Good song. She likes the song. And her next feedback was the song should be like a sailor in a big green coat, because they actually say that during the song. Anyway, just this little carpool story and some Babbel lessons for you. Here's a special limited time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/bulwark. Get up to 55% off at babbel.com/bulwark. Spelled BABBEL.com/bulwark. Rules and restrictions may apply. This is a strange story. I haven't talked about that much, but I just wanted to get your take on it. Ken Klippenstein has been all over this, so shout out to him on the Substack. Which is this memo, this NSPM 7 memo. And there was some kind of a follow-up memo that was sent to that this week. Attorney General Pam Bondi, according to Klippenstein's reporting, ordered the FBI to compile a list of groups or entities engaging in acts that may constitute domestic terrorism, those expressing, quote, opposition to law and immigration enforcement, extreme views in favor of mass migration and open borders, adherence to radical gender ideology, as well as anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Christianity. I guess being anti-other religions is okay. On a face, like, this memo is like absurd and un-American and like crazy. Like the FBI would target. This is basically just saying we're going to target groups that are politically opposed to this administration. In practice, we're like 11 months in, and it's hard for me to see exactly what's happening. What's your sense of this?
Yeah, it's very hard to know exactly what's happening here, but it's very easy to see what the administration is capable of, because we've already seen the administration take pretty dramatic unconstitutional action against far less extremist organizations than anything related to or adjacent to or in the neighborhood of Antifa. So, for example, some of the biggest white shoe law firms in the U.S. have had extremely punitive actions taken against them. Some of the biggest universities in the United States have had punitive action. Lots of, selective prosecutions of individuals. So when I read that memo, what I see is the attempt to import a particular kind of bullying, pugilistic approach that was originally related to law firms, individuals, universities, and then sort of expanding that and trying to pull in the NGO world, the world of activist nonprofits, which are harder to reach in many ways than the law firms or the universities because they don't have as many points of contact with the federal government. A law firm, if you do something to take away security clearances, for example, you're going to cut out the practice of a lot of your lawyers, right? Or if you do things that prohibit their access to the courts or whatever. But when it comes to these NGOs, a lot of them, they don't take any government money at all. They don't have those touch points with the federal government. And so there's just been less ways for the federal government to get at some of these more progressive nonprofits.
It's like auditing them, taxes, opening the books. I mean, is one thing, but the FBI obviously has a lot greater powers than that. I mean, in a worst case scenario, type of investigations they could be doing could be.
This is the first administration in my lifetime where you say it could be worse than my actual worst case scenario. In other words, when I was sitting here thinking about Trump's second term, I did not have in my mind launching an illegal war and then blowing up, committing war crimes in the middle of an illegal war, blowing up shipwrecked survivors, something that is so black and white basic in the rule of law that it's an actual example in the law of war manual of an order that members of the military should refuse. Like it's literally in black and white. I can tell you the page, 1088, Tim, page 1088. It's right there in black and white. Or sending people off to be tortured with no due process in an El Salvadoran prison. I mean, the darkness of this administration is beyond anything I've ever seen. And so, what they would do to target progressive nonprofits and just simply label them Antifa so that, somebody on Fox or Newsmax or OAN says, and look at Trump targeting Antifa terrorists. I just don't think you can really put much of anything past him.
Yeah. And just one more time, looking at that list, like the government can target you if you have, quote, extreme views in favor of mass migration. Like, what happened to the free speech administration here? I thought we were going to have the golden age of free speech. It's like, how would you even judge that? In a free country, the government should not have, should look very neutrally on what your views are of migration when deciding whether or not you've committed any crimes.
Oh, and when you're talking about targeting quote unquote extreme views, one thing we've already seen from the MAGAverse is targeting religious institutions that minister to migrants who've crossed the border. In other words, fulfilling Christian commands to take care of refugees and strangers in your midst, that they are, and we've seen Paxton, Attorney General and Senate candidate in Texas, target nonprofits, religious nonprofits founded by Catholics who minister to people who are in this country, which is one of the most basic and elementary Christian commands that exists. Now, I don't know, when the Catholic bishops got together and they condemned Trump's immigration policies and his brutality in immigration, does that now label them as pro-immigration extremists? Even though, as Pope Leo said, nations get to have borders, but you never get to treat people brutally and cruelly. But as you've seen, Tim, I know you've seen this. If you ever raise an objection to masked men grabbing people off the street based on racial profiling, including American citizens, et cetera, then people say, oh, you're for open borders. Or then if you say, I really don't think that we should be blowing up people without due process and launching illegal wars without congressional approval and blowing up shipwrecked survivors in violation of our own law of war manual, they say, oh, you're for the unimpeded flow of drugs into America.
Or into Suriname in this case, but
or details.
Exactly. Details. Let's talk a little bit more about the Venezuela. You wrote, you had a column recently where you wrote, in the military campaign in South America, Trump and Haig said aren't just defying the Constitution and breaking the law; they're attacking the very character and identity of the American military. Talk about what you meant by that.
Yeah. So, if you want to look at the U.S. military as distinct from other forces, the British military, the French military, I mean, you're talking about the Western way of war, that one of the things that we have prided ourselves on and have imperfectly achieved is that we wage war in a way that is very distinctly different from, say, the way Russia wages war or the way Imperial Japan waged war or Nazi Germany. That yes, our military is lethal. Yes, our military can inflict great destruction, but it's bounded by rules and laws and codes of honor. And, one of the things that really upsets me about the Hegseth the Hegseth as head of Department of Defense is that the things that make the American military distinct, he seems to despise and view as weakness. And the things that make the Russian military so brutal, he seems to admire. And do we want a military like the Russian military? Would we look at the Russian military and say, yeah, that's who we want to be? It's a less effective military than ours. It's a less competent military than ours. And it's a far more brutal military than ours. And, when you look at, I think one thing that, if we have listeners here who are sort of skeptical about laws of war or rules of engagement and how they might tie the hands of soldiers, there are some very concrete military benefits that we have always gotten when we have complied with or upheld the law of war. And I talked about the way in which, for example, at the end of World War II, German soldiers and civilians were desperate to surrender to us, that they were fighting fanatically to stop the Soviet Red Army, which was murdering its way across Eastern Europe. And one of the reasons they were fanatically fighting the Red Army wasn't because they thought Hitler was going to win. Almost everyone knew it was all over at that point. They were fighting a delaying action so that more people could surrender to us. And so think about how many lives were saved, how much territory we gained, because by the end of the war, in many ways, we were advancing unopposed. Right. And the Soviet army was facing ferocious resistance because they were so brutal. In my own deployment to Iraq, Tim, by the end, when we really turned the tide against al-Qaeda in my area of operations, by the end, they were surrendering to us in droves. And they were seeking us out to surrender to us rather than the Iraqi army. Why? Because we treated them with decency and dignity. Yeah. And so I saw the concrete benefits of treating detainees decently in my own deployment. And so this idea that the law of war, and honestly,
just because I'm sure some listeners think about this, but like the fact that there was internal outrage and pushback against the cases where we didn't is part of what we're talking about. We during that era also treated detainees in certain cases in Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib or otherwise wrong. But the fact that we have a free press, that there's a legal system that people can go through in this country, it's not good. It's not a pat ourselves on the back, but it still is a distinct difference from the alternative.
Right. We have never fought a war in total compliance with the laws of war. There have been individual soldiers and commanders and units that have gone rogue, that have done the wrong thing. But people were prosecuted in as a result of Abu Ghraib. There have been many war crimes prosecutions, and then, not all of them are. Some are more solid than others. But it really seemed as if even going into the Office of Secretary of Defense, that Hegseth was kind of indiscriminately behind these guys and supporting these guys who'd been accused of war crimes and in some cases convicted. And so you just saw, and he wrote in his book how he advised his men to ignore the briefing by an Army lawyer, that when he received the JAG briefing in his deployment, that he then immediately instructed his men to ignore the briefing. Now, I've read the description of his briefing, and I'm very skeptical about the details of that story. But the bottom line is, he goes and he hears a legal briefing by a JAG captain, and then immediately just tells his men to disregard. If that is true, if that is actually what happened, that's a dangerous person. That's an extremely dangerous person.
I spend more time in the MAGA fever swamps than you probably. I think that you have a little bit more time among the right-wing intellectual crowd than I do these days. Have you heard any good faith, serious case for what we're doing? The whole thing is kind of crazy to me that that it's we were repelling against a Venezuelan oil tanker yesterday. What is the case that is being presented from? Who's for this besides Marco?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have not heard a coherent defense from anyone who I would consider serious and honest.
Got it. Okay.
So people that I consider serious and honest are people who have differed from me. Let's take, for example, my friend and former National Review colleague, Andy McCarthy.
Sure.
We do not see eye to eye on all the legal developments over the course of these last 10 years. We have what I would call honest, good faith disputes about some of the legal developments over the last 10 years. And Andy has taken a position, especially on the Russian investigation, that was more in line with Trump arguments than me. But I never have questioned Andy's good faith. I've never questioned his honesty, his approach to the law. And he is one of the most vocal voices saying this is completely wrong. And this is somebody who Trump has trumpeted, when Andy has agreed with him, right? And so I have not seen.
Yeah, even outside of the legal, like I'm moving more into just like what is the objective? It's hard to even understand the rationale, like for what is.
I have heard a rationale. This is the only rationale that makes sense.
Yeah,
that the rationale that I have heard is that by liberating itself from the law of war and doubling down on cruelty and lethality, that the Trump administration is trying to deter drug smuggling. That by taking off the gloves, it's going to deter drug smuggling into the U.S.
We haven't tried that one before.
I mean,
are these like the cavemen, like the unfrozen cavemen who they missed the 80s? Okay, sure. I think drugs will find a way in the words of Jeff Goldblum. I think drugs find a way, and in particular, these drugs aren't even coming here. Like most of them aren't even coming here.
And he keeps doing this extremely dishonest thing where he's talking about the horrible toll of fentanyl and applying it to what are pretty obviously, if they're drug smugglers at all, cocaine smugglers out of Venezuela, when fentanyl is coming by and large from Mexico. So he's not even hitting at the number one driver of American overdose deaths at all here. He's doing something else. And look, I'm so glad you brought up the history. This is the first time we've really launched a lethal undeclared war where our own forces are engaging in the combat. But we have been providing military assistance and intelligence support to South American militaries for a long time, including in large-scale operations. We actually had an effort where the CIA cooperated with local air forces to shoot down drug smuggling planes, which was something that really wasn't on the headlines until the operation shot down an American missionary rather than a drug smuggler. And so these attacks are imprecise. Rand Paul, I have a lot of beefs with Rand Paul, but God bless him on this issue, produced a study last week where he showed that when the Coast Guard does interdiction, which is actually the best way of trying to stop drug trafficking, is you stop the boat, you seize the boat, you grab the drugs, you arrest the crew, and guess what? You then get to question them. Who's your supplier? Who's your distributor? All of these things, right? You can't question people blown up by a missile. And so, but what he found was that there was more than 20% of these interdictions, these stops, there were no drugs at all. And so this sort of idea that we have the best intelligence, we can absolutely know. Look, I've helped approve airstrikes. I've seen the intelligence. I understand how difficult it is to get very, very precise intelligence. And the idea that, Hegseth can look at us straight in the face and say, we absolutely know who all, come on. Are we really that naive still?
Yeah. Well, also, we wrongly sent at least dozens, maybe hundreds of we don't know at this point how many of the people we sent to El Salvador were wrongly sent, but we know that many of them were. So now we're trusting the same people going after the same alleged enemy of Tren de Aragua, and that they got it 100% right this time. Okay. On the history, part of the reason I'm bringing it up is on a previous podcast was recommended the book Everyone Who's Gone Is Here, which I'm in the middle of right now, but kind of like the origins of the Central American migrant crisis and all this. It's excellent. All right, you don't have to let big wireless and your overpriced phone bill suck the joy out of the holidays this year, because right now all of Mint Mobile's unlimited plans are 50% off. You can get 3, 6, or 12 months of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. It's their best deal of the year and makes it real easy for you to give your expensive wireless bill the Scrooge treatment. All Mint plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text on the nation's largest 5G network. You can bring your current phone and number over to Mint. There's no contracts and no nonsense. Also might be an opportunity. Those folks in Australia, down under, the koala lovers, they're banning kids from using social media, keeping kids off their phones till 16. That might not be a bad idea. I should maybe do a podcast on that. But if you got a teen in your life, somebody in the 16 range, Mint Mobile, it's a good opportunity for them. Cheap. You can put the little Find My on their phone so you know where they're going. That's something to think about if you're a parent. Turn your expensive wireless present into a huge wireless savings future by switching to Mint. Shop Mint unlimited plans at mintmobile.com/bulwark. That's mintmobile.com/bulwark. It's a limited time offer. Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for a 12-month plan required. It's a $15 a month equivalent. Taxes and fees are extra. Initial plan term only. Above 35 gigabytes may slow when the network is busy. Capable device required. Availability, speed, and coverage varies. See mintmobile.com. One more thing before we get to MAGA. Did you see the story about how we're going to start checking people's social media, visitors, last 5 years of their social media if you want to come to this country? Well, for starters, utterly un-American. I mean, we might as well be China. What's the point of competing with China if we're just going to be China? Number one. But just a more living in New Orleans, like the economic element of this, and where our tourist places in America are already struggling. People don't want to come here, for various fears, some legitimate, about what might happen if they're traveling here, depending on their visa status. And, just wrong and stupid and harmful to the economy would be my take. I wonder if you have what your thoughts.
Let's see.
Anything to add to that?
Let's see. Wrong, stupid, and harmful to the economy. Yeah, I'm going to agree with that completely and totally. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that what we're looking at is that the Trump administration, especially in the Trump campaign, especially during the election and the run up to the election, sort of used the free speech, land of the free kind of language to pull in a lot of kind of the anti-woke, heterodox sort of a lot of the people who'd been driven away from the Democratic Party by ideological intolerance and censorship and cancel culture, et cetera, and then presented itself as we are the champions of liberty and free speech. This is how you get a lot of these tech lords, the ketamine crazed tech lords into the movement. But anyway, you get kind of this tech world. You get a lot of the heterodox sort of folks who are really tired, and many of them have been living in deep blue areas where they felt a lot of intolerance and cancellation, et cetera. And then they're tied into this movement under this free speech and liberty banner, only really, and as if they have eyes to see, to realize that everything awful about cancel culture, this administration has taken and has turned the dial again, to 11. It's just absolutely turned it way up. At the height of the cancel culture craze, you did not see the kinds of explicit federal intervention into free speech that we're watching now systematically across sector after sector after sector. And there are going to be people who say, well, what about, the Biden administration attempting to jawbone social media? What we're witnessing right now, Tim, is so far beyond bureaucrats jawboning a social media site over coronavirus stories that it's hard to even see that in the rear view mirror at this point. It's one of the most comprehensive attacks. I was talking to an expert in free speech, and I said, look, I don't want to engage in hyperbole. I said, my own view is that the current environment for free speech is worse than the Red Scare, but not as bad as the Wilson administration. Because Wilson, a lot of people forget, he jailed his political opponents by the hundreds.
Sure, yeah.
And this person I was talking to said, no, I think it's worse than Wilson, and I'll tell you why. He said, yes, no, we have not seen the jailing at large scale of political opponents. We're seeing that sort of starting to try with Comey prosecution, et cetera. But when Wilson was doing that, he was doing it without the free speech case law that exists now. In other words, he wasn't defying the known legal precedent on free speech. And in fact, one of the first big cases after the Wilson era was this dreadful Schenck versus United States case that actually upheld one of his political prosecutions on the basis that, handing out leaflets opposing the draft was like falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, creating a clear and present danger, to the body politic. And then it took years after that, for decades after that, for all of this Supreme Court free speech precedent to build up. And so his point was, Trump is actually defying the law in a way that Woodrow Wilson never was. Now, I'm still going to say, I still think Woodrow Wilson was worse.
And it's pretty bad for you to say it's worse than the Red Scare now. I would have thought that's kind of borderline.
I think when you look at the depth and breadth of what's happening, it's worse than the Red Scare. It's worse than the Red Scare. It's
not just government, folks. You know what I mean? It's government going after regular people.
And you also have the dynamic of, and, you know, when I was reading, to circle back to the memo about domestic terrorism, one of the things the memo talks about was acts of intimidation designed to sort of suppress political participation. I was like, oh, you mean MAGA? Everyone knows what happens if you run crossways with MAGA now is you're going to get flooded with threats. You're going to get flooded with acts of intimidation. I mean, you know, we've been watching awful things happen in the state of Indiana when the Indiana senators are not willing to do this snap redistricting. There's been swatting. There's been threats, avalanche of threats. It's horrific. And so, you know, I'm reading the memo and I'm thinking, physician, heal thyself. I mean, this is one of the most aggressively intimidating political movements I've ever seen in my entire life, certainly in the United States in my adult lifetime.
You also wrote recently, the article is, well, these days you can't say what the article is titled because, you know, the digital gurus are testing out 8 different headlines to see what people will click on it the most. But the one that was served to me was, what do Republicans think about each other? And you talk about the Tennessee experience. You're in Tennessee. You know, you basically, the short of it is that I kind of view these new MAGA entrants into the party, which makes up now about a third of the party, give or take, are folks that, you know, were not traditionally Reagan conservatives, either because they were younger, because they used to be Democrats or independents, or used to be not involved in politics really at all and have jumped in. And you know, how they're much more conspiracy minded. We're going to talk about the conspiracies in a second, but I'm kind of more interested in your kind of assessment of on the ground, like how that conflict is resolving itself, like where the momentum is, who's winning, and like what you're seeing on the ground.
Yeah. So, you know, just to set the stage here, I wrote this article after the Republican won in Tennessee, 7th District of Tennessee, which is my district that I used to live in until May of this year. Spent many years in this district. And he won by 9 points, which you think, that seems pretty healthy. No, he replaced somebody who in 2024 won by 21, and Trump won that district by 22. So it's a 13-point negative swing against the Republicans from the Trump numbers. And when you look even closer, that looks even more remarkable because it's a 13-point negative swing against Republicans when he was running against somebody who won the Democratic primary pretty far left with only about 27% of the vote or somewhere in that neighborhood.
Yeah, she had a very narrow plurality. Yeah. Very
narrow, who was not, and this is not a compliment in Tennessee, she was called the AOC of Tennessee, had some pretty controversial posts in the 2020 George Floyd era, including one where it kind of looked like she was celebrating burning of police stations. And then had this this podcast moment where she talked about how much she hated Nashville. And part of her district is in Nashville. So this was not someone designed like in a lab to contest this district. This is a very poor fitting candidate for the district. And she still improved by 13
Well, it's
points.
Even ideology, too. Also, it was vibes. Like, you know, Graham Plattner, you could say, is lefty, might not be perfect. You know, all of his views might not be perfectly representing, you know, kind of rural Maine. But, like, you know, he's a farmer. He's a lobster farmer. His affect is very kind of rural and populist. Like, she was, I mean, she just seemed like a lefty, you know, poster, you know, on the internet poster, right? Like, Yeah.
And so what I wrote about was what we've seen for a long time, and it's just growing and growing and growing, is the new entrants, this really phenomenal Manhattan Institute poll that I think was fascinating about the difference, what it called core Republicans and the new entrants, where a lot of these new entrants, which are people who are more ideologically, say, populist, more conspiratorial, et cetera, have really moved into the party. And they have aggressively contested party control at the grassroots. And this has happened all across Tennessee. And so what's happened is that the MAGAverse, which used to be really, truly much more of an online phenomenon, if you weren't on Twitter, your experience of the Republican Party wouldn't be that dramatically different. It's still all the same
You're just
people
like a
at the meetings.
50-year-old church-going Republican who's got a family and taking kids to, sporting events. Like you might, and like is not a big consumer of political social media. Like things might not feel that different. Trump, the president's weird, but like but like you're the people in your life seem like this similar.
And then people like me who are seeing the rising weirdness of MAGA, who've been experiencing it through the threats and the intimidation. And we sit there and we wave and this is going on because it hadn't penetrated to their lives yet. We look like we're crazy people. What are you talking about? You're just nut picking. If people knew what that was, you're just picking out the extremes and the fringes. But what we saw was the building wave. And now that wave has crashed all over the country. And you have, say, for example, in Williamson County, Tennessee, where I used to live, we had Republican civil wars year after year after year, where you might say like the Moms for Liberty hyper MAGA faction is fighting the more establishment Republicans, often in the most vicious of ways. And so the thing that has kept Republicans together, even across all of that, was really two things. One was a shared affection for Trump. I mean, it's way past time. Nobody should say that virtually any Republican now is holding their nose to vote for Trump. Very, very few. So even the core normie Republicans like Donald Trump. So they had a shared affection for Trump, and they had a shared antipathy against the left, specifically sort of the view that the Democratic Party was far, far left. Well, two things are happening at once here. One is Trump's not on the ballot anymore. So that shared affection for Trump is not holding the coalition together as much. And then number two, the Democratic Party isn't the same party as it was in 2020, and the Republican Party is getting more extreme. And so the Democratic Party has been moderating as the Republican Party has been radicalizing. And so a lot of that means that normie Republicans are now facing worse treatment and more vicious treatment from MAGA Republicans than they've ever experienced from Democrats. And while you still have a coalition that's hanging together, you can see it's bleeding numbers. My goodness. I mean, did you see some of the election results from earlier this week? Just remarkable. And so I think what has happened is while a lot of the Republican disunity has been obscured by the continued affection of partisan Republicans for Trump, you go one layer below that, just one layer, and the whole thing is starting to pull apart at the seams. This coalition is not a stable coalition of people.
There's just a Bolt's Mag, which I really like for like very nerdy elections analysis, and they looked at like 2017 versus this year. Republicans actually did worse this year than 2017 ahead of that 2018 wave. The other thing is just to put a finer point on what you're saying locally is that's what I'm hearing, at least. And Tim Alberta has talked about this, and from an evangelical perspective, my friends that are still in Republican politics tell me this. While the Manhattan Institute poll made it seem like the legacy Republicans, there were still more of them than the new entrants. It was like 2/3, 1/3.
Yeah.
At like Republican events and stuff, like in Republican groups, they've been totally run out. And so like you're
totally.
like that Moms for Liberty fight that you were talking about before, where it's like the crazy people are fighting against, the irregular church going, whatever, traditional school board member Republican. Like the Moms for Liberty people have run the traditional person off the school board. They don't want to even deal with them anymore. They're so crazy. And so they're like the crazier conspiratorial Tucker Candace people, which we're about to get to, are like dominating in these offline spaces too. Are you sensing that?
Well, so it very much depends on jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Sure. I would say the fight is very, very real. In my experience in Williamson County, there's been actually some real success in the establishment kind of beating back the more extremists. And just to disclose I'm so close to this district that my sister-in-law managed the campaign of an establishment Republican against a radical MAGA challenger, and she managed the campaign of the Franklin, Tennessee mayor. And then my brother-in-law is on the Williamson County School Board and was targeted even though he's a staunch Republican, targeted by the more crazy people viciously, to the point where he had to get security And what was the reason why they targeted him, Tim? He worked for Pfizer. No, Pfizer. Yeah.
Not relationship to you.
We don't have the same last name. And so the problem you have is that it's in some areas, the fight is over and MAGA won. I don't think there's any areas where the fight is over and like the establishment won. But here's the way I'd put it.
Georgia is pretty good. I shout out Georgia is where the strongest pushback has happened. We saw this a little bit in the local elections this week, but for almost entirely,
Well, and Tim, you have more experience, in your previous life in dealing with sort of the grassroots party folks. I was always much more involved in the legal side, the conservative legal movement. But when I would go to like a grassroots Republican gathering, and I don't know if this is your experience, it was sort of like this. You would have a room full of people who were like bankers, lawyers, insurance agents, people were stay-at-home moms, like just a collection of normie folks from the neighborhood. And then you have a couple of people over in the corner who were like, I formed the anti-Sharia law nonprofit, or I have the crazy
they've got a pamphlet for you. Yeah.
Yes, they've got the pamphlet. They've got a card. Yeah. They're gonna try to jump in and dominate the conversation. But they were on the edges of the room. You fast forward to now, and the whole thing is flipped. The bulk of the room are the people with the crazy ideas, the people who are the fanatical, more extremist, conspiracy-minded individuals. And a lot of the normies are the ones at the edges that are sort of trying to cling on. And this dynamic has an effect over time, especially when you no longer have the unifying figure of Trump to rally behind in an election. And especially if the Democrats actually try hard to pull in moderate and centrist voters. That 13-point swing, Tim, just to show you how much opportunity is out there for Democrats, that 13-point swing in Tennessee 7 was the lowest swing yet. Yep. The lowest. All of the others were between, like, say, 16 and 28 points. And so think about what could have happened had the Democrats run somebody that was really crafted to appeal, to the district. And I think you're going to see some pretty, assuming present trends continue, which is a dangerous assumption, but just assume it for a moment. I think you're going to see in many districts, there's a lot of more moderate Democrats who are running. And I hope that they can win their primaries. And if you do see that, you might see some pretty surprising flips in this next cycle. You might see some pretty shocking outcomes.
Okay, really quick on the crazy side, I got to talk about Tucker and the Tates before I let you go. On the Tucker element, two things caught my eye yesterday. Tucker, who is, dominating the podcast charts. He's everywhere. He's going to be speaking at the TPUSA thing. Obviously, he has the ear of the vice president. So this is not a fringe figure at this point.
No.
He was on Theo Vaughn's podcast. They did like 3 hours. I haven't made it through all of it yet, but one of the clips that went public was Tucker was basically, kind of saying that like he's open to Candace's conspiracy theories about who killed Charlie Kirk, and then he had to do a selfie video where he kind of was like, well, he walked back a little bit, but he's just like, basically, I don't trust the FBI. I don't trust the FBI. Yeah. This is main takeaway. So he did kind of a just asking questions thing, and I'd then walk it back to like, well, I'm really just saying I don't trust the FBI. Simultaneously, there's this I interviewed Olivia Nuzzi last week, and it took me a while to figure it out. I'd read this part in the book but she anonymized all the names, and I figured it out yesterday that her and Ryan Lizza both were saying that Tucker had communicated to her that Israel. This was in private, that Israel was potentially involved, and that that Olivia should be worried about herself because this was. It's hard for me to tell whether Israel was trying to sabotage RFK or whether RFK was an agent of Israel. But like, I think it doesn't matter, or maybe both. The more interesting thing to me is like these are all private conversations, right? So like in the question of like, what, is this all a show? In a private conversation with Olivia Nuzzi is telling her that she's got to worry about Israel being involved in a conspiracy involving her. Anyway, thoughts? I guess I don't know if there's a question there. Thoughts on Tucker?
I think we're way past the point of saying this is all an act.
Yeah.
If it's an act, it's like one of the best acting jobs I've ever seen in my entire life. And especially, and similar with Candace similar with some of these other figures. And, one thing that I learned in the practice of law, Tim, one of the questions that you're often asked when you want to be a lawyer is, how can you represent somebody whom you know is lying? Or how do you represent somebody who, is lying? And one of the things that you realize is that when the stakes are high enough, people will believe their own BS. That people don't live for very long in that tension of being an intentional liar. They will often migrate to and rationalize to the point where they can pass lie detector tests for some of their craziest assertions. That the human brain's a very interesting thing. It's an incredible engine of rationalization. And so I think at this point, and you also have to understand that once you enter this space, the next thing that happens is you're bombarded with messages from people who are like, finally, yes, here's this secret memo I found. There's this huge population of people out there who've been doing their own research for a long time on lots of things. And so you get immediately hooked in, you're mainlining all of a sudden a lot of the thoughts and ideas of the most disaffected people in society. And I think it just has this corrupting effect on the brain. So I think that these people are sincere in their beliefs, and that, in my view, just makes things so much worse, because you're talking about radicals radicalizing influencers, and then influencers turning around and radicalizing the public to the point where it is not uncommon, Tim, to encounter an incredibly normie, let's say homeschool mom, who's raising their kids and teaching them sort of classical education. And then you peel 1 inch below the layer of normality, and you've got the wildest conspiracies underneath it, just the craziest stuff. And that's becoming just more and more and more common. A lot of people write off the audiences of Tucker and Candace as, well, that's just fringe. They're huge audiences. And you'd be shocked at some of the people who listen.
Yeah, I don't know. To me, that's why at some level it kind of doesn't matter whether they believe it or not. To me, it matters in the sense that because his audience is so huge, if this is the type of person that in private conversations thinks that Israel's involved in an assassination conspiracy related to RFK and Olivia Nuzzi, and is open to the idea that Candace, who's anyone that does not look at Candace and then say you're having a psychotic break and you need to get off camera, is complicit. And apparently both Tucker and Theo Von are looking at Candace and saying maybe it's possible. Lastly, on the Tates, Barron Trump spoke with Andrew Tate. It's a great New York Times story. Andrew Tate and his brother, the Romanian sex traffickers, they do the worst manosphere stuff about just kind of women should serve men and all that machismo. And we learn more about how the Trumps helped get them off the hook for their sex crimes in Romania, including a mild frenemy. Were we ever really frenemies? No, actually, that's not true. Someone I have disliked for a long time, Richard Grenell, who helped, who called the Romanians, apparently. And within days of the second conversation with Grenell, Romanian prosecutors handed their Tates their freedom to travel. So they bucked pressure from the Trump administration. To me, this story shows, just the moral debasement of the Trump administration, that they're pressuring Romania to release these sex traffickers, but also how deep it is at a personal level that Barron Trump, who, you would think would have all the self-confidence in the world, being a tall, handsome, rich kid whose dad is the president, feels like he needs to have a relationship with these guys that are doing this kind of hate, women need to serve men, and talk. It's pretty bleak across the board.
It's extremely bleak. It's also extremely consistent with the Trump administration's treatment of some of the worst people in the world. You have a Chinese crypto billionaire pardoned because, right after he has helped increase the value of Trump's family crypto holdings, who then now is subject to a lawsuit claiming that his company might have been helping funnel money to Hamas. You have a former, Honduran elected official who's pardoned after he trafficked hundreds of tons of cocaine to the United States. And you're blowing up low-level drug mules, but you're pardoning the drug lord. And the only consistent theme is they had friends on the inside. They have friends in the administration, and Andrew Tate is no exception. And he had friends on the inside. And, I think the Barron the Barron Trump part of it is interesting because it really does sort of give the lie to or prove the lie to the notion that all these guys are speaking to just struggling men, young men.
Yeah.
There
alienated young men who are not getting enough attention from women and are, don't have enough economic opportunity. Barron Trump.
And look, there are people out there like that. No question. I've met them. I interact with them all the time. But there's an awful lot of people who love them some Andrew Tate and other manosphere influencers just because they're assholes and like calls to like. These people are seeing in Andrew Tate, they're seeing in other manosphere figures the kind of person that they are and want to be. And so this is not a thing where you look at an Andrew Tate and say, well, it's a shame that this person speaking to disaffected and alienated youth has so many problems. I mean, that's the Tucker Carlson spin. Even though he has personal problems, his message. No. What these people are doing is it's like calling to like. They are sort of sending out this call of the wild, a beacon for all your angry, exploitive, vicious men, and then urging them to double down on all the worst elements of their nature. And this is a part of the manosphere story. Part of it is struggling young men reaching out, but a part of it is just assholes calling out to assholes.
Yeah, and to your point, it's worse than that. Even in some ways, it's assholes encouraging moldable young men to feed the worst parts of their nature, right? And that is what's so disgusting. And what's so disgusting about them is that they're sex criminals and that we let them off for some reason and pressured a foreign government to let them off. But like that is what their culture is encouraging, is taking people that are trying to figure out their way in the world and saying, no, feed your dark wolf, feed the dark part of yourself. Yeah. Women are terrible.
Absolutely.
Rather than trying to improve themselves. David French, thank you as always, man. I really appreciate your insights. Have a great Christmas with the family, and we'll catch you in the new year.
You too, Tim. Always great to talk to you.
All right, we'll be back tomorrow for another edition of the podcast. See y'all then. Peace.